What if the Bible didn't just speak to your faith, but reshaped how you live in the world? The Anabaptist Community Bible invites you to read Scripture through the lens of Jesus, centered on peace, community, and radical discipleship. With insightful commentary from a diverse community of voices, it helps you engage Scripture in ways that are both deeply personal and powerfully communal. Whether you're studying alone or with others, this is a Bible designed to transform how you follow Jesus. Get 20% off your copy today at menomedia.org with code SHIFTING. Discount expires May 15th, 2026. The Anabaptist Community Bible. Read together, live differently.
The words that have stuck with me over time are pretty close to this. We cannot know what we are to do unless we know what story of which we are part. That's true for Hindus, like it's true for evolutionary materialists, like it's true for street level hedonists, like it's true for Jews and Muslims and Christians too. The story, the meta narrative shapes how we think about our place in the world, what for blessing and for curse. It just does that.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. We live in a world that won't cooperate with our best hopes for it. The causes we give ourselves to don't fully succeed. The marriages and families we love are marked by the now and not yet. The justice we work toward remains incomplete. And somehow we have to figure out how to keep going with gladness and singleness of heart. Stephen Garber has spent decades thinking about this exact problem. He's a teacher, a cultural translator, and the founder of the Washington Institute for Faith, Vocation and Culture. His new book, Hints of Hope, is a collection of essays about making peace with what he calls the proximate. Not giving up on the world that ought to be, but learning how to faithfully live within the world that is. Today, we talk about the difference between hope and optimism, what it means to be a wounded healer, how the Clapham Society and Tolkien's hobbits illuminate our moment, and why the question of what it means to be human is more urgent now than ever. This is a conversation for anyone who has ever felt the gap between the world they long for and the world they inhabit, and still, they choose to show up anyways. So join us. Here is my conversation with Stephen Garber. Stephen, welcome to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
It's a gift to be part of your life for a little bit, Joshua.
And it's a gift for everybody who's listening to be able to listen to you. We're going to be talking about your new book, Hints of Hope, essays on making peace with the proximate. That word proximate is something that you use often. It is a word that guides some of your thoughts in your life. What is proximate, and what's that to you?
I would never say that proximate is a magic word, Joshua, because it can't be that. But I would say that all of us need a word like that to keep our hearts alive. It's just too hard in this wounded, broken world to keep going, and as Anglicans put it, with gladness and singleness of heart day after day, without having some ability to make peace with what's not quite right. Maybe what sometimes is grievously, tragically not right. Of course, that goes from the most intimate parts of life, like marriages and families, all the way across to public squares and nationally and internationally. I mean, how do you long for the world that ought to be, but realize when you wake up in the morning, you go to bed at night, it wasn't like that. It didn't become like that today. I tried, I hoped, I prayed, I did it again, yesterday and last week and all last year. But even with my best shot, it didn't become all that I wanted it to be. Maybe all that I imagine God wants it to be. So how do you live with that? How do you live with, as the theologians put it, the now but the not yet? And for me, proximate is a wedge or a prism into making sense of the life that we are called to live in this wounded world that's still a beautiful world.
I mean, I love that I get to pray in the Lord's Prayer that your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And we get tastes of that, and we get some beautiful pictures and pieces of it, but we're not going to see it in full until the consummation, right? And so what does that then look like? Your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven in this now and not yet period that we're living in?
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful question, Joshua. In the introduction, which I've called Seashells on the Seashore, I've reflected a little bit, first on Leonard Cohen's evocative, haunting song, Broken Alleluias, but then walking along, a seashore, and, sure, I was seeing down below me, 6 feet below, beautiful seashells in the morning sun and the glistening water coming in across the sand, and stopping to pick it up and thinking, oh, there's a little hole here, isn't there? The other side was broken. There's a broken piece off this beautiful shell. The colors were so beautiful and the shape seemed so wonderful. But looking at it more carefully, you see it too is broken. So the book begins there in some ways in a very ordinary, experience for most all of us who, are watching the world and thinking, well, that's beautiful, isn't it? But then when you begin to pick it up more closely and look, you think, it isn't quite the way it's supposed to be, isn't it? It's too is broken. Well, if that's true as seashells on the seashore, my wife and I have been married for 49 years this year, and I would say it has been a signpost of the kingdom coming in these 49 years. Does that mean, in fact, that every hour of every day has been just wonderful and happy and perfect and complete in all imaginable ways? No, it can't be that way. Why? Because it's a now but a not yet world, and she's still fallen and I'm still fallen and we miss each other, we hurt each other, we say and do things which miss each other. But I would say there's a touchable happiness between us. There's an honest, true, real happiness and joy between us most of the time. Bob Dylan has a song which I've quoted in the book simply called Most of the Time. And it's pretty good, actually, most of the time, which accounts for, well, there are signposts of, as you say, that prayer that you yearn for as I do, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. I live now my life more for signposts than having to think, well, God in heaven, you are the sovereign over the whole of history. Make this happen today. I don't think that way anymore, I don't think. And it's because I have given up on hope, but I've come to, in the title of this book, I'm more content, I think, with hints of hope, making peace with the proximate, with things which are true and honest and real and right, but they're not everything.
There's so much brokenness in the world. You're talking about brokenness in family, in marriages, in brokenness in just how the world works. There's dehumanization that's happening in front of our eyes, constantly on our screens. We're just seeing brokenness always. And I know that there are people that said, I want to do some really good work in this world to actually help alleviate some of that brokenness. And so if there are signposts and just hints of hope, what does justice type of work of trying to bring some healing to this world, what does that then look like if there's just hints and signposts and we can't see it all come to fruition yet?
Well, in some ways, it's the question of my life, Joshua. Like I taught politics for a long time, and with eager 20, 21-year-olds who wanted to do their best for history, with their shoulders to history, to change the world. Really, when I responded to that as their professor, I was eager to take up the questions with them. But I also, came over the course of years teaching them to give an end of the semester lecture, which I argued that there's a difference between hope and optimism. That optimism is an idea that's rooted in a lie about history and the world. And if I'm smart enough, I've got the right resources, I know the right people, then I'll get it done. And of course, in a Washington, D.C. kind of a swirl, you can imagine, well, is the question going to be immigration reform or the U.S.-Israel relations or, tax policy, or you can pick a question. But, there's nobody smart enough, there's nobody, well-resourced enough to make all justice happen in this time in history. I mean, if the call of God in the scriptures is, what do I require of you, O man? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. Well, that has personal meaning, of course, but it has public meaning too. And for those of us who long for the public meaning of our faith, there has to be, a sense that, well, could you put your shoulder to something that matters, realizing that, without going into it as Eeyore, thinking, well, it won't all be, and, why even try? I would say I give my life in many ways, Joshua, to people who are doing good work, who still believe that good work matters to the world. So I do that with my life. I join in on efforts with people who think, well, there's something true about the world still. It's still God's world after all. And if we can put our shoulders together and try and hope and pray together and work at it, well, there's good work that can be done. I could name names if you wanted me to do that, but there are things I give myself to that I would say, whether they're more local, more national, more international, where I think, well, that's worthy of my life, to give myself to trying to do something that's touchable, that's honest, that's true, that's right, that's important, that matters. One project I would just name in the briefest of ways has been called for 20 years now, the Economics of Mutuality. It's an unusual name, I suppose, but it's brought into being by, of all companies, the Mars Corporation, which makes M&Ms, of all things. It's a privately held company 100 years into its life. It isn't a faith-born company like Chick-fil-A in that way. But I would say there's been a conscience within the company, the family, to try to think about the right things, do them in the right way for a long time. And 20 years ago, I was drawn into a conversation with two executives who'd been asked by one of the owners, what's the right level of profit for a company like ours? Most of the time, that wouldn't even be a question. The only question would be, how do we maximize profit this quarter? But if you want to keep making money because you're privately held, and sustained profitability is more the reason behind what you do, then maybe you could have other questions. I eventually took these executives to meet a writer named Wendell Berry a few years into our work together. And on his farm for a day, we talked about this idea of trying to rethink the business of business we were trying to do. At the end of the day, he put it like this to us. If you want to make money for a year, you ask certain questions, don't you? But you want to make money for 100 years, you have to ask other questions. And I would say we're trying to ask the other questions because the vision's a longer vision. So the project moved from McLean, Virginia, to now it's headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. It's a global effort to try to engage companies and countries over this idea: could we rethink the business of business? Now, I have no, pretend in my mind, I'm not romantic at all, that somehow heaven will come to earth in all of its fullness with this project. But I do think it's worthy of my life to give myself to trying to create signposts of the world that could be and should be.
You've already mentioned a few times right now asking good questions and the right questions and maybe some better questions. How has questions shaped the way that you see the world and you enter into the world and you partner with others to bring about this hope?
I'm looking at the sign behind your head, Joshua, shifting culture, and I don't know all that it means, for you in this, but I think back to my own, dropping out of college days, a long time ago now. I was 20-year-old, and the counterculture was sort of dominant in the Western world, and I ended up living in communes for a while of my life in the Bay Area of California. When I went to Europe the next year, and I ended up at a place called La Brie. And if there was a word on the street, among the hitchhikers of Europe, like I was, there was this place up in the mountains where you could ask an honest question and get an honest answer. And that really drew me and a lot of other people into this little place, the possibility that there could be an honest question asked and the possibility there could be an honest answer given. I would say, Joshua, in the professor life I've had, the teaching life I've had for all the years of my life, now, I've always wanted that ethos, intellectual ethos, to be the pedagogical air we breathe with my students. That I want you to know, student, that you are for me this year, this semester, in this period of your life, that for me it matters centrally, crucially, that back and forth between us, that you need to know that I want honest questions, honest answers to be the air we breathe together in the classroom.
So what does an honest question look like?
That's good. That's a very good question, of course. Well, in some ways, this is maybe too pedantic, but it's to say it that way, you realize, of course, you could ask a dishonest question. You could offer a dishonest answer. So an honest question for me is a question where there's a hunger for what is real and true and right. Now, it doesn't mean that you have any idea, but there's a sense in which, you know, because you talk to people all the time, like I do, you realize that, in the course of the days of your life, Joshua, there are some times you meet somebody you think, I'd like to know more, because you have a sense of urgency or honesty or candor, or the heart is yearning for understanding in a way. So for me, when I think about the honest question, it is something born of that kind of honest yearning. St. Augustine's called the apostle of longing for good reasons, because he understood that the heart of every human life, most fundamental, is our longing, what to belong for. So when I have a sense that a student or somebody I meet on the streets, is longing for reality. He's longing for this to understand the meaning of this. I want to understand, please. I want to know. Well, I will give my heart away to that kind of a person, frankly. I would say a dishonest answer would be, well, that I don't take the question seriously. I have a canned reply. These are the things I always say to everyone everywhere. I have not really listened to you carefully because I don't care what you think personally. And I have what I want to say, and you need to be willing to hear what I have to say to you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening and thank you for supporting the show. If you'd like to support the show and get early ad-free episodes, you go to Substack at shiftingculture.substack.com. And with your subscription, you could have a private podcast feed in your podcast app where you get to download early episodes before anybody gets to listen to them. You could also support the show by going to the support the show link at the bottom of the show notes in the app that you're using right now. That goes to a page that supports the work my wife and I do around the world. That donation is also tax deductible. So if you want a tax deductible donation, you could go there. Or if you want to support the show by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really helps new listeners find the show as well. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you so much for supporting this work so that we could see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. You mentioned Augustine there and his longings. You talk about love and the longing of love as well in your book, and that ordering our loves is quite important, and making sure that we have our loves aligned with what is right and good and what is true. How does that work to make sure that we align our love, we align our longing into something so that we can actually bring about some of these signposts and this hope in the world?
That's very, very, very good question, Joshua. We can't do it by ourselves. That just doesn't happen. So it has to be done communally or corporately, I would say, which is why the prayer you offer said that you pray yearningly day after day. Your kingdom come. It begins with our Father who art in heaven. Give us this day. So I would say that a good life, a godly life, a whole life, a holy life is always going to be a life which begins with, I can't do this by myself, on my own. One of the best stories I know is a story of a group of serious Christian people 250 years ago in London. And they were representing diverse vocations in banking and politics, the arts, education, church. And they decided to move to a neighborhood outside of down to the Thames, just about 2 miles away. We would call it Wimbledon today. But they called it Clapham, and it's still known as Clapham. It's a neighborhood. But they bought houses near each other where they could have meals together day by day and pray together day by day and live a life out together over the course of years together. We've sometimes called them the Clapham Society. The best known person in the story, he's not the lone person. It's a misreading of history to put William Wilberforce as the story because he wasn't the story. He was part of a story with other people. But I would just say, thinking about their time in history, what they were doing, they took on the primary engine of the British Empire when the British Empire was the empire that ruled the sea, ruled the world. The sun never set in the British Empire in those years. And what made that so? The political economy was born of the slave trade, which is amazing to think about. you know, and they called that into question. It took them a long time for the law to change, but together they lived a life out day by day, thinking, talking, praying, being aware of your work in the world of banking, my work in the world of politics, your world in the work of the church, your world in the work of the arts, and there was a sense of we're in this together. I don't think we can order our lives well ever on our own. So if I talked about, to my students years ago, teaching politics about the difference between hope and optimism, I would also leave them at the end of the semester with another lecture I called The Politics of Self-Deception. And I want them to think about this as a problem, that in fact, we are most of all prone as human beings, sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, to lie to ourselves about ourselves. We're most of all prone to that. Father Adam, what did he first say? The very first word out of his mouth after the fall, where that woman you gave me, he was deflecting immediately, initially, just by his instinct. We've been doing that ever since then. All of us have been rumbles and rumbles and roars across the centuries and through the cultures. But that, of course, has its own poignancy and terrible face in the world of politics, where we are most of all prone to lie to ourselves about ourselves. So if we're going to order our lives rightly, remembering that Augustine wrote his book, his magnum opus, The City of God, while Rome was literally burning. It was imploding while he wrote his book. About what? About how does a city order its loves rightly? And he was identifying, of course, that in Rome, which was the eternal city, it would go on forever and ever and ever. It was falling apart before his very eyes. And he was analyzing it principally through the lens of disordered loves.
Yeah, a lot of what we've been talking about here, one thing that really helps me is to put myself into the meta narrative, the big story, the story of God, which is, creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. Like, put myself here, like I'm in the now and not yet. And that's really helpful. Know what Christ has done, what he will do, but also real stories, human stories like the Clapham Society that you just said, or stories of myth and legends, and stories of something like Lord of the Rings. You say in your book that we are all hobbits, or you're a hobbit. I read that little piece to my wife this morning. It was so good. But so how do then these stories like Lord of the Rings, becoming a hobbit, how does that then help us situate ourselves on the journey to let us know what is reality, what is true, and then how we actually then interact with what is true and bring about goodness?
I wish we had more time to talk, Josh, because I'd like to know a lot more about you, but I'll try to respond to your question here. One of the writers that's influenced my thinking a lot was a professor of moral philosophy at Notre Dame named Alistair MacIntyre. And he wrote a very much discussed book called After Virtue, a generation ago now. But of all that he said, it was complex and challenging read for me in those years of my life. But the words that have stuck with me over time are pretty close to this. We cannot know what we are to do unless we know what story of which we are part. That's true for Hindus, like it's true for evolutionary materialists, like it's true for street level hedonists, like it's true for Jews and Muslims and Christians too. The story, the meta narrative shapes how we think about our place in the world. What for blessing and for curse. It just does that. So you're right. I've lingered over the story of Tolkien's hobbits, and they have much influenced my thinking about myself. I think, as I wrote in the book, when I read the stories when I was a young, almost just still a bigger boy, very young man, I loved them, and I loved them, and I loved them even more, really. But I didn't like the last 100 pages of the story at all. I thought it was kind of boring. Thinking, well, Mount Doom has come and gone. What are we going to do now? Have to walk back to the Shire to do what? The story's all over, isn't it? When I read the books years later, I found myself thinking I wasn't old enough to understand why this mattered, why Mount Doom wasn't the end of the story, why, in fact, those 100 pages, walking back to the Shire mattered. I didn't understand, but now I do. I've lived a longer life now. I hadn't been able to hear Gandalf say to Frodo, "Not all the wounds in this life are going to be healed, Mr. Frodo." Well, that's a sober word. At age 20, I don't think I even knew that was being written in the book. I didn't even think about it. I didn't stop to think about it at all. Years later, I thought, wow, I know that life. I know that world. Because I've lived in the now, but the not yet for a long time now. Been aware of the wounds of the world for a long time now. It does not mean, Joshua, that I've given up. So one of the last chapter I've written about that fascinating story in the Gospels, where after the death and resurrection of Jesus, or at least I guess the death resurrection too, but the apostles are very aware that Jesus has died. All the hopes they had seem to be crushed now. Everything is done with. All that we wanted to happen, all of the things that we had given our lives to. What else is there now? It's all over, isn't it? Now all over now. So here are these two disciples walking to Emmaus, as the story goes, and they're just lamenting out loud about all the hopes that have been crushed finally by what has happened in the last days in Jerusalem. And mysteriously, of all mysteries, all of a sudden there's a third person in the conversation. Turns out to be Jesus. Somehow of divine, mysteries of life. He's listening in, and he asks, "Well, what is this?" And he says, "Well, are you the only person in all Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happened these last few days?" Well, of course, we know the story now. We understand that Jesus says, well, let me tell you the story, the deeper story, the longer story. And of course, he says, starts off with the beginning and walks his way all the way through the Old Testament scriptures and shows, in fact, how his death and resurrection were, in fact, the point of the longer story. And it says, of course, when they got, to where they're going that night, they wanted him to join them for supper, and their hearts were alive. They were awakened. They were, flamed, because now they knew the relationship between what had seemed so despairing, so discouraging, and what in fact the deeper, longer story promised.
I mean, as you started to relay what Gandalf said to Frodo, that not all wounds will be healed, and then you're bringing it into the story of Christ, and he's like, here, the deeper hope. One of the things you said is Christ's vocation is of a wounded healer, and
Yes.
that as imitators of Christ ourselves, as those who do follow Christ, that's part of our vocation. That's what we should be as well, as wounded healers. Even Frodo in the Shires, he's there. And for us in this now and not yet, what does it mean to carry our wounds into the world to bring about some healing?
That's a very, very good question, Josh. Again, I think whenever I've read The Lord of the Rings, especially the older I got by reading them, now as a longer lived man, you get to the very last part of the whole book, the third book, and they get back to the Shire, and the chapter is called The Scouring of the Shire. And after they've gone through all of the travail, all of the terrible things they've gone through, they've longed to be home, finally home again. They realize it's been overturned completely. The Saruman has come over and changed everything, And Tolkien calls the chapter The Scouring of the Shower. I remember thinking it didn't seem fair to me that they have to have that, after all they've been through. So that was part of me reading, thinking, how could this even be fair? They have to do that, at the end like that. So that in that chapter called Wounds and Scars, I wrote about my own physician and named him a wounded healer, and I wrote a little bit about his life, why that made sense to me to put him in that language of, J.B. Phillips and then Henry Nouwen. But realizing that, if it is true for all of us that we are called into the imitation of Christ, which is fundamental to our own identity and our own calling as the people of God in the world, to be giving ourselves to the imitation of Christ. And if I've mentioned Augustine and Tolkien, I can also mention N.T. Wright here, who wrote a book, a Lenten meditation many years ago that had some words that caught my imagination. He said, the vocation of Jesus was to take into his own heart the most remarkable joy and the most remarkable sorrow. And as we take up the imitation of Christ in our lives, we too will find that same remarkable joy and remarkable sorrow. And we are called to weave them into the pattern of our days. Well, I knew it even at that time, because this has been true for most of my life, I'm not going to be a Buddhist in this life, Joshua. And Buddhism requires, for all of its quietness and all of its simplicity and all of its beauty, and I get that part of the appeal, but it requires a denial of the difference between joy and sorrow, because everything has to be one at the end of the day. All has to be the same at the end of the day. And it's illusion to imagine otherwise. But I knew in my life then, and I know it now even more painfully, more poignantly, there's true joy and there's true sorrow in this life. There's true joy and there's true sorrow in this life. And I'm aware of both every day of my life. So to be a wounded healer, in my mind, it is to walk into the rooms of the world that are worlds that are ours, and somehow be able to communicate that, I hold in my own being both the joy and sorrow of Christ. I know because of what I do in my life, I speak a lot to people in different places in the world, and I know that I have a hope, Joshua, that every room I walk into, that when I'm finished speaking, people will know that I live in the same world they do. I don't live in a world that's, unmarked, unwounded, that's, happy, happy, happy all the time. It's true joy in my life, and I want to honor that. But I also live in the world where, we have tears too.
One of my favorite art pieces there is by Makoto Fujimura, is
Yeah.
Tears of Christ. That, for me, brings me sorrow and pain and loss, but it brings me also joy, just seeing the art piece of the beauty of it, in the midst of the sorrow and the pain. And you can actually hold that, it holds tension in that piece.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think we can hold the tension of joy and
Yeah.
sorrow in this world
Mm-hmm.
together?
I mean, it's a wonderful question again, Josh. You have the best questions, actually. I think we do it with frailty. We do it with some mystery, because we're never going to get it all right all the time. I think in some ways to have a theological imagination that accounts for both probably matters very, very much here. Because if we are theologically formed in a way which cannot make sense of both, that's a problem. You know, I have a lot of friends in Nashville who sing a lot of songs and been doing this for years and years. And there once upon a time was a movement called CCM, contemporary Christian music. And I don't have a grief against the idea of Christians making music at all. A lot of my friends are very good musicians who live in Nashville. But I know that, there was, in the worst of those days, they counted how many times you mentioned Jesus in every song. And you couldn't sing songs about unhappy things either. You know, I had one group who were very close friends who, were very well known all over the world and for their good music. And they'd had a very heart aching tragedy happen in their lives in the course of a weekend. A friend was terribly killed in a car accident. Came to the studio on Monday morning wanting to do their work, but they couldn't get beyond the tragedy. They wrote a song about that. Wasn't a Christian radio station in America that would play the song because it wasn't happy enough. Well, that's pretty bad and awful, actually. It's really awful because, of course, you set up a Christian public, a listening world, which thinks, well, it's all happy, happy, happy all the time. Well, it's not. Nobody really lives that way. Nobody has that life. But in some ways, we act as if we should pretend with each other that it is that way. It's not that we should be Eeyore. I don't want to be Eeyore. It isn't we should be modern. We should just be talking about grief all day long. I don't want to be that either, really. But I don't want to be somebody who ever comes off as I don't live in the world that really is there.
As you were walking through holding both joy and sorrow together, it seems to me that as you're walking through these stories of what it means to be human, to live a strong life, a lot of times we forget what it means to be human in this world. And for you, what is humanity? What does it mean to be human? I actually think this is probably one of the most important questions we're going to be asking going forward in our days, especially with AI and other types of things. What do you think it is to be human?
It's such a good question, such a deep question. This is for more than we can get into right now, Joshua. But when I was again, the reason I dropped out of school and lived, where I did and doing what I did for a while was I wanted better reasons to be a student. I wanted more reasons than just to pass the next test. In the first year, I was living in the Bay Area in Palo Alto and in a commune. We did a magazine together, but I was living kind of week by week between UC Berkeley world and the Stanford University world. It was just listening to all kinds of people say all kinds of things. And I began to realize over that year that the deeper question behind everything I was listening to, whether it was about, the arts, about beauty, about sex, about politics or economics, the deeper question behind every one of those was, what do you believe to be true about human beings? What does it mean to be human? And then what does it mean to be human really was the guiding, vision behind everything everyone said about everything, actually. Literally, that was true. And I was in my 21-year-old life, I was thinking, I know enough of my family's faith, which was Christian, were good, honest Christian people, to know that Christians believe that we're made in the image of God. But I remember thinking that's a very short sentence. What would you say after you said that? So when I went to L'Abri, the next year, I really went in with that question: what does it mean to be made in the image of God? What does it mean to be human? So it's fascinating to me that your question would be what it is, as we talk right now. What does it mean to be human? I do think in some ways it's maybe the most perennial of all the questions. It's what is man? You were mindful of him, Psalm number 8. gives it to us poetically. So realize that as human beings, have been asking this question for a long time. I think along the way, I began to realize that sometimes the church, in its disposition to dualism, which is profound, plaguing to us around the world, that we make a distinction between to be holy and to be human, as if those are somehow different things, different conversations to have. And that, of course, is to miss the meaning of the deeper story, the meta-narrative we've talked about together, is to somehow say, well, to be holy is this, be human is this, whereas I think the biblical vision is to hold them together, profoundly, beautifully, mysteriously, with complexity, but beautifully, they are held together. To be truly human is to be most holy. To be most holy is to be truly human. And I think to see that, understand that, in some ways, maybe changes the conversation we will have about what does it look like in the ordinariness of daily life for all of us. Because we're not having to talk about, doing a special religious thing. We're really talking about what does it mean to be a human being then in God's world. One of my dearest, trusted, most friends is a musician and producer of musicians in Nashville, Charlie Peacock. And he wrote a book years ago about this very question. And he made the argument that Christ didn't come to make us be Christians. He came to make us be humans. He gave us the possibility to be human beings again. Well, again, that is a different mindset to have, isn't it? The work of Christ redemptively is to allow us, sons of Adam, daughters of Eve, that we are, to become human beings again. Well, that's a different way to tell the story. So it has meaning for how we eat and what we eat and how we live and the clothes we wear and the gardens we have and the work we do and the politics we take up and the art we believe in. And your graphic behind you, you describe is purposely chosen because it says certain things about what it means to live in this world for you. Because of why does that matter? Well, because of the things you feel most deeply, Joshua, about what it means to be a human being in this world, in God's world. So I would just say the question of being human, runs everywhere. It has profound implications, and it has to be always seen as being the very same longing that to be most holy is to be most human.
Something you said near the end of your book about having a telos in our hearts is really helpful in the midst of all of this tension that we live in and struggling to find hope and becoming hope ourselves. What does that tell us? What does that aim for our hearts?
I mentioned that book by Alistair MacIntyre, After Virtue. And in that book, he wrestles himself with that relation of telos to praxis, or at least talks about telos quite a bit, but a telos-based ethical vision for him. That was part of the book, actually. And his argument was we've given up on that telos, which makes for a disastrous consequence for how we live in the world. I mean, again, if we were just sort of talking face-to-face, sitting on a park bench somewhere, we could talk about this extensively, but we both know the world well enough to know that there's a lot of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die that runs its way through history and through every place we imagine on the face of the earth today. I would say that it fascinates me, and has for years, how in both Old and New Testaments, those poetic words are repeated in both Old and New Testaments. Why are they repeated? Well, you have shifting culture behind your head there. That's the name of your podcast. Well, in the culture of the day, the prophets and the apostles both heard that language as, well, why not then? Why not then? Just eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die. And you can see that that's a way to get at the telos question for a certain kind of a person. I would say in some ways why I lingered over Nietzsche as I did, in the book, was realizing, well, here he argued, the middle years of the 1800s that God was gone. We need to grow up and get over that. Well, there's a chapter that perhaps you remember. I began in Vancouver, British Columbia, and looking at the beauty of the mountains and the ocean, and writing about the novelist Douglas Copeland, maybe the most postmodern of all postmodern novelists that we have in the world today. But he has fascinatingly, quite intriguingly, and surprisingly, a little novel called Life After God. So in some ways, he's reflecting on the Nietzschean world a century and a half later. Now, within it, Friedrich, thank you. Let's talk about it, okay? What's it really look like to be alive in your world where God is gone? The very last page of the book, to everyone's surprise, you think, really, you're going to say this, Mr. Postmodern novelist that you are? Face boy, picture boy. I mean, you are the person who's given us the language of Generation X of all things. You are that man in the world. And the last page has these words. Well, I need you to sit down now. I need to say something very important to you. I want to be a kinder man. And I've come to realize that to be kinder, I need God. I want to love more fully with my life. And I realize that to do that, I need God. Uh, Now, I'm not interested in a cheap belief about anything, Joshua, and you aren't either. I would say there's a line in the sand in terms of telos, of what is the point of life, that has to do with, is there a God in the universe or not? Now, how to get that right and understand that well and have commitments and convictions that are informed, rightly and truly. Well, that's its own challenge, of course, But I would say that, from why to me, when I listen to the Old and New Testament writers quoting the poets of the day, why not then eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die? I realize now I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. The largest landowner in Albemarle County is Dave Matthews, the musician. Interesting. He had all these historic farms in Albemarle County because of the millions he made, singing the songs to the world. One of his best known songs is called Trippin' Billies. So he is the poet laureate of 21st century Albemarle County, Charlottesville, Virginia. Trippin' Billies has what line in it? Why not then eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die. So the question of telos, to me, matters supremely. We don't all have to be Presbyterians to believe this to be true, but the Presbyterians and the Anglicans of 400 years ago, together over 10 years, wrangled their way through Christian conviction for the moment. They called it the Westminster Confession and then Catechism. And the first question of the Catechism is well known to many of us. What is man's chief end? And we realize that is a telos question, isn't it? It's a question of what is your life all about anyway?
It's beautiful. Stephen, couple quick questions here at the end. It's been a fantastic conversation, but I like to ask, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
I can only smile as I come back to you, Joshua, back to what we've already talked about, to learn to ask honest questions and to not be willing to take anything less than an honest answer.
Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Well, I mean, I could say 1,000 things because I read pretty regularly and widely, but since we're between sort of Christmas, Advent, and Lent and Easter, we put it within those bookends, okay? Every year for a long time, I have read Dickens's A Christmas Carol during the Christmas season, and I do so because they are really important questions that are asked by Dickens. In some ways, harder for us to put the minds of our hearts around the reality that Dickens and Marx wrote their stories, wrote their books at the very same time in the very same city. So Marx was writing Das Kapital, Dickens was writing A Christmas Carol. Literally the same years in the same city, literally the same neighborhood in London, actually. Both about the very same thing, though we do like Dickens better than we like Marx, don't we? But what's Marx writing about? Well, industrializing Europe, the haves and the have-nots, keeping in tension with each other. His answer wasn't a very good one. He misread the human being, human person at the heart of the analysis. That was the fundamental flaw for Marx. I get that. I'm not a romantic about those things. But what did Dickens write about? Well, we can sort of maybe miss the moment if we fail to understand he was writing about the haves and the have-nots, industrializing Europe in the middle years of the 19th century. And he names them, gives them names, Ebenezer Scrooge and Tiny Tim, but don't miss the point of the story. His story, in many profoundly, is the same story that Marx was writing at the very same time. And because of my work in the marketplaces of the world in these years of my life, I'm very interested, of course, in Scrooge as a man of the marketplace. And he'd really, in some ways, he'd missed the point of his own life because he misread the point of money, the meaning of money. He'd imagined it in that language of Augustine. He'd misread the loves that could actually animate and give meaning to a man in the marketplace. He made money mean too much for him. He disordered his loves. So the story is what, fundamentally? It's a story of the reordering of loves in that sort of traumatic long night of his soul. I read that every year and think about it again every year. coming into the weeks of Lent, and the weeks towards Easter, I have for years and years read the first 125 pages of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Uh, it's the story called A Just Man, the story of the bishop, Bishop Bienvenu. Um, Now, I have loved, more than loved, the stage version of Les Mis, as we call it. It's grand and it's glorious and it's as good as you get, actually. But you get about 5 minutes of the bishop's life there on stage, which is beautiful and it's profound. And, I've bought your soul for God. Those are the best words you probably ever hear on stage, you know. But you miss the story of the bishop's life. You don't understand why it was that he lived the life that he had. And I want every year during the days of Lent uh, to rethink my own life, to make sure that I'm learning again who was this man that Hugo called a just man. In my frailty, in the longings that are deepest unexpressed most of the time in my life, Joshua, I want to be more like that.
Very impactful for me as well. So great recommendations. Thank you for taking us back to something that we should be rereading again and again to ask the right questions of what life looks like. Hints of Hope, your new book, is out anywhere books are sold. People could go and they could get that. Highly recommend it. It's a beautiful work. And thank you for helping us make peace with the Proximate. It is something that is much needed in this world. Is there anywhere that you'd like to point people to even find out anything else you've been doing, your work, or anything else?
Well, maybe just to say, of course, the book is available at every bookstore and every online marketplace. If I were to say to pick a bookseller, I have a man I much respect who, among my peers, is called the best bookseller in America, named Byron Borger at Hearts and Minds Bookstore. Easily found. He offers as good as, maybe even better book service than Amazon does. So put that in your uh, mouth, Jeff Bezos. But he offers the best service anywhere, as far as I'm concerned. I write. I mean, I do a lot of things week after week. Some things I post on through LinkedIn these days. Sometimes I offer things. People are surprised that I write more serious things on Facebook, but I have for a long time. I've done that for a long time. Somebody said, "You're trying to redeem Facebook?" I said, "Not really." But they'd say, "Well, it seems like you refuse to kind of go along with, kitty cats." And I said, "Well, or with political diatribes. I don't do that very often at all. I want to reflect on deeper things." Um, there's a website called the Washington Institute for Faith, Vocation, and Culture, where a lot of my writing is located. Um, there is a book we like to talk about today at all called The Seamless Life, Tapestry of Love, Learning, Worship, and Work, which is a collection of about 40 essays with photos that I took over time and wrote. Most of those first appeared on the pages of the Washington Institute. So that would be a repository of some of this. So.
Excellent. Well, Stephen, thank you for this conversation. I just pray that we could all make peace with Proximate and that we could live in a way that is like our vocation, that is, as imitators of Christ, we be wounded healers, that even in the scars, the world of the pain of the world, that there is actually hope and healing, and we could find some hints of hope. So thank you, Stephen. It was fantastic.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Joshua.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out. Share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.